In the book The Ego and the ID by Sigmund Freud, Chapter 1. Introduction provides an overview of his psychoanalytic theory, which is based on a structural model that divides mental life into three components: ID, ego, and superego. In this chapter he explains how these different parts interact with each other to form our conscious experience as well as unconscious motivations for behavior. He also discusses some key concepts such as repression, defense mechanisms, and dream interpretation in order to better understand why we act or think certain ways even if it goes against what society deems acceptable or logical at times. Finally, he concludes by emphasizing that understanding one's own psyche can be beneficial when trying to make sense of their actions/thoughts so they may lead more fulfilling lives overall. In Chapter 2 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud introduces his structural theory. He begins by discussing how he believes that mental life is composed of three distinct agencies: the ID, ego, and superego. These entities are in constant conflict with one another as they strive to satisfy their own needs while also trying to maintain a balance between them all. In order for this equilibrium to be achieved, there must be an effective communication system among these components which allows each entity's desires or demands to be heard without being overwhelmed by those from other parts of the psyche. This process involves both conscious thought processes, ego, as well as unconscious ones, ID. The next section focuses on what Freud calls the reality principle, essentially our ability to recognize when something we want may not actually benefit us in some way if it were obtained right away. Instead, we can delay gratification until later so that its effects will have more positive outcomes overall than immediate satisfaction would provide us with at present time. To illustrate this concept further, he uses examples such as hunger pangs versus actual nourishment requirements or sexual urges compared against long-term relationship stability goals, etc. Finally, he concludes Chapter 2 by introducing yet another important factor into psychoanalytic thinking, namely repression, whereby certain thoughts/feelings deemed too threatening either consciously or unconsciously get pushed down deep within ourselves where they remain hidden but still exert influence over behavior nonetheless. In Chapter 3 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses his concept of the ID. He explains that it is an unconscious part of our personality which contains all primitive drives such as sex and aggression. It operates on a pleasure principle where its only goal is to seek immediate gratification without regard for consequences or morality. According to Freud, this instinctual energy can be seen in infants who are driven by their needs with no consideration for others' feelings or desires. Furthermore, he states that while we may repress these instincts due to social conventions, they still remain active within us throughout life, influencing our behavior even if unconsciously so at times. Finally, he argues that understanding how the ID works helps explain why people act out certain behaviors despite knowing better, because there will always be some underlying motivation from deep within ourselves driving those actions regardless whether conscious or not. In Chapter 4 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses his concept of the ego. He begins by noting that it is not easy to define what exactly constitutes an ego because its boundaries are so fluid. However, he suggests that one can think about it as a mental agency which mediates between external reality and internal instinctual drives. In order for this mediation process to be successful, there must exist certain mechanisms within the ego such as repression or sublimation in order to keep these two forces balanced. Furthermore, Freud argues that since both conscious experience, the ID, and unconscious processes, the superego, play important roles in determining behavior, then they too should be taken into account when considering how our egos function on a daily basis. Finally, he concludes with some reflections on why humans have developed their own unique sense of self-awareness, something which sets us apart from other animals, suggesting that perhaps we need this awareness in order to better understand ourselves psychologically speaking. In Chapter 5 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses the concept of superego. He explains that it is a part of personality which acts as an internal moral guide for individuals. It develops from identification with parental figures during childhood and serves to regulate behavior in accordance with societal norms. Superegos can be both harsh or lenient depending on how they were formed. Those who experience strict parenting may have harsher superegos than those whose parents were more permissive. Additionally, he notes that while some people are able to control their impulses through conscious effort alone, others require assistance from their superego in order to do so successfully. This could manifest itself either positively, through feelings such as guilt, or negatively, in forms like anxiety. Finally, Freud suggests that when one's ego becomes overwhelmed by external demands placed upon them by society at large, then it will often turn towards its own inner resources, namely its ID and or superego, for help in dealing with these pressures effectively. In Chapter 6 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud introduces his libido theory. He begins by discussing how sexual instinct is a fundamental part of human nature that can be seen in all aspects of life from infancy to adulthood. This instinctual drive for pleasure has been referred to as libido or sexual energy throughout history. According to Freud, this libidinal force is responsible for both conscious and unconscious mental processes such as dreams, fantasies, desires, and emotions, which are often expressed through symbolic language like metaphors or symbols found in literature or artworks. In addition, he argues that it also plays an important role in psychological development since its presence helps shape our personality traits over time due to its influence on behavior patterns during childhood years when we learn about ourselves through interactions with others around us who act out their own drives based upon what they have learned themselves previously, i.e., transference. Finally, he concludes by stating that although there may not always be clear evidence linking certain behaviors directly back towards one's underlying sexuality, nevertheless these instincts still remain active within each individual regardless if they choose consciously acknowledge them or not, thus making up an integral component necessary for healthy functioning individuals overall. In Chapter 7, Freud discusses the reality principle. He explains that it is a process of adaptation to reality and involves postponing immediate gratification in favor of long-term goals. The pleasure principle seeks satisfaction through instinctual drives, while the reality principle requires us to delay this gratification until we can find an appropriate way or time for its fulfillment. This allows us to take into account external factors such as social norms when making decisions about our behavior and actions. In addition, he argues that repression plays an important role in allowing individuals to adapt their desires according with what society deems acceptable by suppressing unacceptable impulses from consciousness so they do not interfere with rational decision-making processes based on the reality principle. Finally, Freud suggests that neurotic symptoms are caused by conflicts between these two principles. If one cannot reconcile them, then anxiety may result, which could lead further psychological disturbances like hysteria or obsessional neurosis. In Chapter 8 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses defense mechanisms. He explains that these are processes which protect a person from anxiety or distress caused by unacceptable thoughts or feelings. Defense mechanisms can be conscious, such as repression, or unconscious, such as denial. They may also involve distorting reality in order to make it more acceptable to oneself, such as rationalization and projection. Other common defense mechanisms include displacement, reaction formation, regression, and sublimation. All of these serve an important purpose for individuals who use them, however they can become maladaptive if used excessively over time, leading to psychological problems like neurosis or psychosis. In Chapter 9 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses his concept of the Oedipus complex. He explains that this complex is a universal phenomenon in which children develop an unconscious sexual desire for their opposite-sex parent while simultaneously feeling hostility towards their same-sex parent. This conflict between love and hate creates anxiety within the child as they attempt to resolve it through various defense mechanisms such as repression or displacement. According to Freud, these unresolved conflicts can lead to neurosis later on in life if not properly addressed during childhood development. Furthermore, he argues that resolving this complex successfully leads one into adulthood with healthy relationships with both parents and other authority figures throughout life. In Chapter 10 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud examines how narcissism is related to ego development. He begins by discussing what he calls primary or infantile narcissism, the idea that a child's first object choice is itself. This primary narcissistic attitude can be seen in children who are overly attached to their parents and have difficulty separating from them emotionally. It also manifests as an excessive need for admiration from others. From this initial state, Freud argues that individuals develop secondary forms of narcissism which involve taking pleasure in one's own body parts, example, physical beauty, or accomplishments, example, academic success. In addition, people may become fixated on certain objects due to unresolved conflicts with parental figures during childhood. These attachments often take on a narcissistic quality because they provide comfort through familiarity rather than genuine satisfaction derived from external sources such as relationships with other people or meaningful work activities outside oneself. Finally, Freud suggests that some degree of healthy self-love should exist within each individual so long as it does not interfere with social functioning nor lead to feelings of grandiosity and entitlement over others. In Chapter 11 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses his concept of an ego ideal. He explains that this is a mental representation or image which serves as a model for how one should behave in order to be accepted by society. This can include ideals such as morality, success, beauty, etc., but it also includes more personal goals like being kind or generous. Freud argues that these standards are internalized from external sources during childhood development and become part of our identity over time. He further suggests that when we fail to meet these expectations set out by our own egos, or those imposed on us, feelings of guilt may arise due to not living up to what we believe ourselves capable of achieving, thus creating tension between reality and expectation within oneself. Finally, he states that while striving towards perfectionism might lead people into neurotic behavior patterns if taken too far, having some sort of goal-oriented ambition helps individuals stay motivated throughout life's journey. In Chapter 12 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses the ego and superego. He explains that while both are part of a person's personality structure, they have different functions. The ego is responsible for reality testing. It mediates between external demands from society or other people on one hand, and internal needs such as instinctual drives on the other. It also serves to protect itself against danger by using defense mechanisms like repression or denial when necessary. In contrast, the superego acts as an inner moral guide which evaluates our behavior according to societal standards in order to maintain social harmony within us all. This includes punishing ourselves with guilt if we do something wrong or fail at achieving certain goals set out by these standards, example, success. Finally, he states that although there may be conflicts between them due to their differing roles/functions, ultimately each must work together harmoniously so that we can function effectively in life without being overwhelmed either internally, by instincts, nor externally, by expectations. In Chapter 13 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses how the ego is related to both conscious and unconscious processes. He explains that while it can be influenced by external stimuli, its primary function is to mediate between instinctual demands from within, the ID, and reality outside itself. In order for this mediation process to occur successfully, he argues that a certain amount of tension must exist between these two forces in order for them not only coexist but also work together harmoniously. To illustrate his point further, Freud uses examples such as dreams or slips of the tongue which demonstrate how our inner desires are often expressed through symbols rather than directly stated thoughts or feelings, thus allowing us some degree of control over their expression without completely repressing them altogether. Additionally, he suggests ways in which we might use defense mechanisms like repression or sublimation so as better manage any potential conflicts arising out of this dynamic relationship with ourselves, ultimately leading towards greater psychological health overall. In Chapter 14 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses how the ego interacts with external reality. He begins by noting that while it is true that a person's inner world can be seen as an isolated system, this does not mean they are completely cut off from their environment. Instead, he argues that there must exist some kind of connection between internal processes and what goes on in the outside world for any meaningful interaction to take place. To illustrate his point further, Freud uses examples such as dreams or slips of the tongue which demonstrate how unconscious desires may manifest themselves through seemingly unrelated events occurring externally. Freud then moves on to discussing defense mechanisms, these being psychological strategies employed by individuals when faced with anxiety-provoking situations so as to protect them from harm or distress caused by confronting difficult realities head-on, example, repression. In addition to providing insight into why certain behaviors occur despite conscious intentions otherwise, i.e. due to repressed wishes, understanding defense mechanisms also helps explain why people often act differently than expected even though they have been presented with all relevant information beforehand, something known colloquially today as cognitive dissonance. Finally, Freud concludes chapter 14 stating that although we cannot always control our reactions towards external stimuli, especially those stemming from instinctual drives, if one has sufficient self-awareness about their own motivations/desires, then it becomes possible for them to make more informed decisions regarding interactions within society at large. In chapter 15 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses how the ego defends itself against anxiety. He explains that there are three main defense mechanisms: repression, regression, and reaction formation. Repression is when a person unconsciously pushes unpleasant thoughts or feelings out of their conscious awareness. This can lead to psychological problems if it becomes too extreme. Regression involves reverting back to an earlier stage in development as a way of coping with stressors. For example, someone may act like they did when they were younger in order to avoid dealing with current issues. Finally, reaction formation occurs when people express emotions opposite from what they actually feel, for instance expressing love instead of hate towards something or someone who has hurt them emotionally. All these defenses help protect us from feeling overwhelmed by our anxieties, but can also be detrimental if used excessively, since we then become unable to process difficult experiences properly. In chapter 16 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses how defense mechanisms are used by individuals to protect themselves from anxiety. He explains that these defenses can be conscious or unconscious, but they all serve a similar purpose: to reduce tension caused by external stimuli. Defense mechanisms include repression, the pushing away of unpleasant thoughts; reaction formation, replacing an unacceptable impulse with its opposite; projection, attributing one's own feelings onto another person; and displacement, shifting attention away from oneself. Freud also examines other forms of resistance such as denial, rationalization, and intellectualization, which he believes play important roles in protecting people against their anxieties. Finally, he argues that understanding the role played by defense mechanisms is essential for successful psychoanalytic treatment, since it allows therapists to identify areas where patients may need help overcoming psychological barriers created through defensive behavior patterns. In chapter 17 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses transference in psychoanalytic treatment. He explains that it is a phenomenon which occurs when patients transfer their feelings about important figures from childhood onto the analyst during therapy sessions. This can be both positive or negative depending on how they felt towards those people as children. For example, if someone had an authoritarian father figure, then they may feel anger towards them but also admiration at times. The same mixture of emotions will likely be transferred to the therapist too. Transference allows analysts to gain insight into what drives certain behaviors and reactions within their patients' lives. By understanding these underlying emotional connections better than anyone else could ever do so without being privy to such information firsthand through direct experience with them over time, i.e., via analysis. It is therefore essential for successful psychoanalysis because it helps therapists understand why some things trigger particular responses more easily than others would normally have done otherwise, thus allowing greater progress overall throughout each session together between client/patient and practitioner alike. In chapter 18 of The Ego and the ID, Sigmund Freud discusses how therapeutic action works. He begins by noting that it is not possible to influence a patient's ego directly. Instead, one must work through their unconscious processes in order to bring about change. To do this effectively requires an understanding of both conscious and unconscious mental life as well as knowledge of psychoanalytic technique. In particular, he emphasizes the importance of free association, the process whereby patients are encouraged to say whatever comes into their minds without censorship or judgment, as a way for them to access repressed material from within themselves, which can then be worked with therapeutically. Additionally, Freud outlines various techniques such as dream interpretation and transference, whereby feelings towards past figures are projected onto current relationships, which may help uncover underlying issues at play in psychological disturbances so they can be addressed more successfully during treatment sessions. Finally, he concludes by stressing that while psychoanalysis does have its limitations when it comes to healing certain types of neuroses or character disorders due to its reliance on verbal communication alone rather than physical interventions like drugs or surgery, nevertheless these same restrictions also make it uniquely suited for treating other kinds of problems where insight-oriented approaches prove most effective. Chapter 19 of The Ego and the ID by Sigmund Freud focuses on how analysis can come to an end. He begins with a discussion about what happens when someone has been through psychoanalysis, noting that it is not always possible for them to be completely cured or even improved in any way. However, he does suggest that some people may benefit from having gone through such treatment as they have gained insight into their own mental processes, which could help them better understand themselves and make more informed decisions going forward. Freud then goes on to discuss the role of transference during psychoanalytic sessions. This refers to patients transferring feelings towards their analyst onto other figures in life outside therapy, such as family members. This phenomenon often occurs unconsciously but can still affect relationships between patient and therapist if left unchecked, thus making it important for analysts to remain aware of its potential presence throughout each session so they are able to handle these issues appropriately should they arise. He also talks about resistance, another common occurrence within therapeutic settings where clients actively try to avoid discussing certain topics due to either conscious or unconscious reasons. Before concluding his chapter by stressing importance understanding both phenomena order ensure successful outcomes at conclusion treatments/analyses overall. In short, while there's no guaranteed complete cure after undergoing psychoanalysis, many individuals do gain valuable insights into themselves and others around them, which ultimately helps improve quality lives long-term basis. Outro.